This evening's program is Media Finance through the Eyes of a Creative, crafting a partnership to drive the business forward. It's often been said you have to spend money to make money. Our speaker will share the moment when he learned that wasn't true, along with other things. His perspective includes maximizing the talent as an asset to generate revenue, right-sizing programming budgets, and encouraging a scrappy approach to programming. We're privileged to hear from a 40-year audio sales strategy veteran who has consulting, management, ownership, sales, programming, syndication, and on-air radio experience. Podcasting, digital delivery, and content creation are all in his area of expertise. He's consulted with hundreds of stations and served as EVP and content and programming for Cumulus Media, where he oversaw a roster of 425 stations and the Westwood One radio networks. And I'd be remiss in saying if I didn't tell you that he's also very active in the community. He's a 2021 inductee to the West Virginia Broadcasters Hall of Fame. He serves on the board of directors for the Alliance for Women in Media, the Country Radio Broadcasters, and is a voting member of both the Country Music Association and the Academy of Country Musicians. In addition, he is a member of the National Association of Broadcasters Long-Term Steering Committee and a member of the Radio Arts and Sciences. Please join me in welcoming Mike McVay, President, McVay Media Consulting.
Thank you very much, Mary, for having me. And thank you to Feng for giving me the opportunity to speak to everyone. I will tell you that a part of my presentation today is focused on the fear that I'm feeling right now, because creatives like myself have a very different perspective. And it was probably one of the biggest factors of getting the gray hair that I did by learning how really important money is. If you are dealing with creatives, if you have, be it program directors, writers, authors, anyone who you might consider to be in the creative side, or maybe more importantly, they consider themselves on the creative side, they just think differently. Excuse me. In looking at it from the radio standpoint, the very best creatives have a party in their head that nobody else can hear and nobody else is invited to. I mean, think about it. If it's around audio, then they're sitting in a room by themselves, talking to a piece of metal, wearing headphones, and they're convinced people can hear them. And that's not right. And so from that standpoint, starting there, I myself started as a on-air talent, grew up in Pittsburgh, PA, lifelong Steelers fan. As an air talent, I decided that I wanted to control my own destiny. And so that meant becoming a program director and moving to a smaller market. And so I went to Wheeling, West Virginia, where I was a program director, morning talent for a while. From there to Charleston, West Virginia. From there to Los Angeles as a program director, where the station was sold. I wanted to learn sales, and I knew that I would have to go to a smaller market to do that. And so I went to Louisville, Kentucky. Those of you who know Louisville know that I said it correctly. And in Louisville, I became an operations manager and a station manager under the general manager. So I was involved in programming, but also carried a sales list. And that's where I first found a budget. I went from there to Cleveland, where I still live, as a general manager. There was a jeweler named Larry Robinson, owned J.B. Robinson Jewelers throughout the country. And Larry was an amazing teacher for me. He'd been in the Harvard MBA program as an instructor before his father, who was J.B. Robinson, passed away, and he took over that business. Larry always made me, as a creative, try to get past the anecdotal and talk about why there would be a cause and effect. If we spend the money and we do this, we should have this. And those were the first moments. I literally had been in Los Angeles and no one had ever sat down and connected the dots for me from not only ratings to revenue, but from that revenue to the cost of operating those radio stations. And so it was very valuable. The first impressions that creatives have of all of you involved in finance, it's kind of like Darth Vader. You know, when you saw the movie and you see Darth Vader and he's breathing through that mask, it's very scary. And that first impression always gave me kind of a knot in my stomach when I had to walk into the office of the finance director or the chief financial officer or that market manager who was responsible for a budget. When I started McVay Media, it was stepping out of an airplane that was perfectly fine. I didn't get fired. I was one of the few people to become a consultant who actually had a job and did it purposely. And fortunately for me, my wife was the business manager, and she was the one with the business degree and understood finance way better than I did. And so we had to very quickly come up with some rules. I was over the creative side. The various programmers and creatives who reported to our company worked for me. She managed the budget. Although I might come up with the marketing ideas, she controlled it. I would have to go sell her on why we needed to do what we had to do. And it made it work. We also had another rule. I don't know how many of you are in family businesses or work with a mate, but that rule became that we couldn't talk about business on Saturday nights when we were at dinner. That's kept the marriage alive for 45 years. That was a really good idea because I was the one who would always bring up something that could get me in trouble. The concept of you have to spend money to make money was shattered pretty quickly when I went into business for myself. When it was somebody else's money, it was easy for me to say that and easy to believe that. But being in business for myself, the initial McVay Media, as I call it, which was a larger global company, was around for 28 years. That taught me how to not only manage a budget, but create a budget, and more importantly, how to be scrappy, how to figure out what I can do that gets the same result without spending money. And in our case, it became a game. It became fun. It became trying to figure out how you use hotels tonight on an app versus booking yourself into the highest rated hotel right away. I'd rather find one that was selling those rooms at the last minute. When I was first starting in McVay Media, and it was my wife and I and an assistant and one other consultant, we were going to run some ads in Radio and Records magazine that's now defunct, but a trade publication some of you will remember. The project and program that we had was about 10 grand. My assistant put together an ad that while it was pitching stuff we were doing, wasn't an intended part of the marketing, wasn't what the ad was supposed to be. When I first saw that ad campaign, I was very upset. And my assistant came in the office and I said to her, we just blew $10,000. We just showed our hand before we were supposed to. And my assistant, Nancy, said, but look, we still got good publicity out of it. And I said to her, Nancy, I could have bought a high-end custom-made sofa for $10,000 and had it in my living room for that. Putting it into a tangible thing that she could have bought worked. Now, I know some of you are looking at each other going, this is what we're talking about today? But I'm telling you, those tangible actions, those things, connect with people who are creatives because we can relate to that. And that brought it back to that for her. When I saw how I connected with her, I used those kind of examples over and over again. When someone would want to spend something needlessly or not think creatively how we could take that money and magnify it, I would think about, can you buy a new car for that? What's something they like? They're a golfer? We could go to Scotland and golf at St. Andrews for that. And to put those things into a concept that they could relate to. Putting points on the board is very important to people whose lives are governed by ratings. revenue are numbers. Ratings are numbers. If you can focus on the same type of tangible, that the numbers of ratings are connected, much like the numbers on a spreadsheet, a budget, revenue, that will resonate with a programmer or talent who's responsible for generating ratings. Those numbers mean something to us. I could get fired if we don't have great ratings. When I was at Cumulus, the current CEO, when she first came in, we sat down and she said to me, we have to be up every year, adults 25-54, Monday through Friday, 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. for the month, year over year. And I remember sitting and saying to her, but nobody has 100. And she said, what doesn't get better gets worse, Mike. And so she wasn't asking me to hit 100, but she was asking me to keep that churn. And we did about 32 months of up year over year ratings. And so those numbers, when it was presented in that fashion, came back to show me then how our revenues started going up and how if we managed our expenses flat, we had more money to put to the bottom line. There was another lesson I learned as a programmer, as a creative. We are trained that the ratings generate revenue. And I was always bonused on ratings. As a program director, I got a bonus on ratings. When I became a consultant, often someone who couldn't meet my monthly figure would give me a chance to make even more money if we hit rating goals. And when I became an executive vice president over content and programming, I received a bonus based on ratings. Well, the first leadership team had 4 years of down ratings year over year. When the new leadership team came in and we sat down, and I was fortunate to make the cut to stay with the group, and we started to implement program and plan that I had designed and was approved by our CEO, I got my first ever rating bonus at that company. I got an extra 10 grand for the month. And I was like, this is amazing. I got a bonus finally. And not long after that, the CEO announced to the leadership team that we were changing our agreements and whatever our bonus structures were would be tied to EBITDA because the CEO's bonus structure was tied to EBITDA. And I remember sitting there not thinking that was a good idea for me. I can't control EBITDA. It's hard enough to even try to control ratings, but at least I felt responsible for the ratings. I was the last member of the leadership team to sign the addendum to their agreement. I was stonewalling when the head of HR, the chief human resources officer, called me and said, hey, the CEO's concerned, you're the only one who hasn't signed their addendum. I had just said, I don't think I'm going to sign it. I'm finally getting a rating bonus. I'm making money. I said, please, I need to speak to the CEO. I got a telephone call from her, and rather passionately, she told me why I needed to sign that addendum if I wanted to continue to be part of the leadership team. I could still be the programming guy, EVP, but I wouldn't be in those leadership team meetings. But the words she said that schooled me, and the last sentence when I went, yes, was she said, you always want your bonus tied to the CEO's bonus. And that clicked. And that was great advice. And so if you can figure out how to reward your creatives around generating revenue, around bigger cash flow, around a net operating profit or EBITDA, and explain those numbers to them, I think you'll find initial reluctance, but a thank you later. I certainly was grateful because I did much better on those bonuses than it would have if I had stayed only with ratings. Now, I was the key person, excuse me, to negotiate with talent for both the radio group and the network. We inherited a bunch of contracts that were not properly sized. They needed to be right sized. They needed to be figured out. And what all of you know that I, as a creative, didn't know is that if you're coming to the end of a year and you're going to miss your numbers anyway, then you might as well either right size it then or terminate the people that you're thinking of terminating in the future anyway and put it below the line and get it off the books for the next year. And we did that. We negotiated with talent who had oversized compensation and suggested that we could give them a cash bonus now and bring their salary down to what would be more appropriate. Even though the numbers may not make total sense, what their agents grasped was me explaining the value of cash now versus cash later. And that was a real benefit to get those things off the book, to reward the talent, and help us get the talent's deals renegotiated. Altering talent agreements also included looking at annual billing. One of the crazy ones that one of my partners on the leadership team came up with, a fellow that always referred to himself as a recovering accountant because he had studied finance at school, suggested that we look at changing bases when we did new deals to mirror election years versus non-election years. When it's a presidential election or a midterm, those even number years have more revenue coming in. And so those would be the years where we might actually pay someone a little more or give them a different bonus structure, one going up, one coming down. And so that base pay may go up in an even year, but the rating bonus may come down because, particularly if you're a news talk station or a news station, the numbers just generally go up around those. It was creative. Not every agent or every talent agreed to that, but those that did, I think, saw the value in it because it gave them greater upside and helped us maintain a status quo. Talent motivation is really important. And I think this is key for not only finance, but legal. Talent are often broken children. They just are. As you've heard me say already, they see things differently. They look at things differently. They wear their feelings on their sleeves. The slightest comment about your show's not performing well from one of you who's not on the creative side can send that personality into a tailspin. It doesn't mean that the person who's coaching them on the creative side or the programmer doesn't have the ability or the right or the responsibility to explain to them why they need to perform better. But coming from anyone outside of that realm is hard for them to accept and grasp. It suddenly becomes a parent-child situation. And so when you have a challenge with the talent, you always want to go to someone who deals with talent regularly because they're just going to speak that language much more clearly to the talent. By the way, the very best talent are sometimes the most difficult. But having worked with people like Don Imus, who's an amazing talent, or today I coach Stephen A. Smith, who's a good friend at ESPN, those talent aren't as hard as you might think because they're successful for a reason. My experience is it's often the people that are not quite there that are more difficult to handle. We already spoke about above the line and below the line in regard to terminations, and I know that you all understand that. But let's talk about being scrappy for a second. When I could use barter for something that would cost me cash, providing I had the inventory available, we did that. When we could elongate a deal and change, like in a renewal, if we were getting $5,000 a month to consult and we could get an extra year going to $4,000 a month, I would do that. The same type of thing holds true for dealing with your programmers, dealing with your talent, and those people in promotion and marketing. What you never want to do is take away the fun. We're living in a world today where particularly those of you who deal with smaller markets understand that Starbucks often pays more and has better benefits than small market radio and TV stations. And so the reason those people are there is they like the showbiz, they like the fun. Don't take that away. The minute it feels like you're working in an insurance agency, you eliminate that reason, and they're going to go elsewhere where they can have more benefit and more security and maybe even more fun. Now, let's talk about what talent can do today. Talent should be engaged in generating revenue. Talent, when renewed with their deals, should do personal appearances, and the radio station or TV station should benefit some part of that. Talent should do ride-alongs with salespeople. Advertisers still love it when they can meet a celebrity. And in smaller markets, radio talent are still celebrities. Not so much in a New York City, unless you're Elvis Duran, or in Los Angeles, unless you're Ryan Seacrest or Ellen Kay. But talent riding with sellers and doing ride-alongs is valuable. A couple things happen there. One, meeting that potential advertiser or that current advertiser, but two, seeing what the sellers go through, understanding it's not easy. They have tough jobs and they have to take those 12 no's to get to yes. Sales reps should also keep their eyes and ears open 24/7 and come back and say when they've heard the radio station playing in a business, when they've run into someone who they know is a potential advertiser or an advertiser who had something nice to say about the station. One of the things that Cumulus started when I was there was the Be a Leader program. And so what that whole thing did was go out and everyone sells. And if I'm a air talent, or even in my case, and I brought in a lead, and that lead turned into an actual new piece of business, there was a $100 bonus for the person who brought the lead, and you got a little rubber wolf. And the wolf's name was Sulu, which was the middle part of Cumulus backwards. Now, that $100 wasn't the most important thing to me, but I had fun collecting the wolves and making fun of the other leaders on our team. And it created some competition and fun camaraderie. The point of it wasn't that we generated a lot of new revenue, although I know they did. The point of it was everybody was focused on generating revenue. At McVay Media, one of the phrases that we regularly bring back is one that I know all of you have heard before. And that is, we eat what we kill. And we just do. Those of you in this Zoom meeting who are entrepreneurs know that. I am, I guess, what some would say is in the fall or maybe even the winter of my career. And yet I feel more motivated than when I was in that spring of my career, because I have a greater appreciation for it now. And I'm having a lot more fun than I've ever had before doing business, helping clients achieve what they want. Because as the book, The 1 Minute Manager says, when my clients get what they want, I get what I want. And building something that I know will continue beyond me. I have to generate 20% new business every year to offset the 20% erosion, which is normal in business. Fortunately, my erosion is not that high. And so I'm enjoying what I'm doing, and we're continuing to eat what we kill. I guess it's the gray hair that betrays me. And people will say, how long are you going to do this? And if I could die at my desk, and if that happens someday, and you read that story in the news, I will have died a happy guy. But it's not about slowing down for me, because if I slow down, at some point the herd's going to stop coming by, and I got to keep eating what I kill. And so my message from all of this is, as a creative, I didn't understand finance. I feared talking to you people, and I was worried to ask for help. Because the only way the turtle gets ahead is by sticking its neck out, and I was elevated to positions I probably wasn't ready for, I went out of my way to meet with my superiors, share my weaknesses, and have them teach me about finance. And they explained to me, not just on a spreadsheet, but how the actual operations made those numbers on that spreadsheet go up in revenue and hopefully go down in expenses or maintain. And so if you can do that same thing, if you can go to creatives and share and engage and motivate them, you're going to find there are people who will help you accomplish what you want. And so, Mary, how should we open this up for questions? I don't know. Maybe Cynthia, that's a you thing. How should I do that? I'm happy to talk about anything, by the way. The only thing I always say is, if there's something you ask me and it's confidential, I will tell you that. And then that doesn't lead to a second question.
So yeah, so we can open the floor now for questions. If you'd like to ask a question or just make an observation, please raise your hand and we will call on you. And if you can come off camera, if you like to, just do that and ask your question.
All right, so Mike, I'll start.
Sure.
How could a finance person kind of break down that wall with creative people if they're not used to walking into the creative area? What would you recommend they do?
I think you've got to encourage the creative that you're an ally, reinforce that you're an ally, encourage them to come to you with challenges. An example would be that my predecessors had made a format change on a radio station in Washington, D.C. that had gone miserably. We had done a research project to ascertain what we could do to improve the ratings and right that radio station, right the ship. The research said basically, put it back to the old format, put the name back, hire the old people back, do all those things. And when we sat there and that research was presented, my then boss, not my later boss, my then boss said, nobody has the stomach for that. And I was like, okay. And we continued to suffer for a while. When senior management changed, my new boss said to me, what do you think is the most critical thing we can do right now that we know will be successful? And I pulled out that research and shared it and was told, put together your plan, get with CFO, see if they'll approve it, and we'll move forward if they do. That put me sitting at the same side of the desk as our CFO, and I saw what an ally he was. And he showed me, I said, here's what I need to do. How do I do this? And he showed me that. And after that, after seeing it, and when we went back collectively and presented it to the CEO, and she said, I can add nothing to this. And I went, is that a yes? And she said, yes. Okay, thanks. And off we went. But that broke down the barrier. That gave me the impetus and took away the fear of walking to him for other things and saying, if I wanted to do this, what would have to happen? How could I make this make sense? And there were things that didn't make sense. things that I thought, if we can do this, it'll work. And it was like, no, this won't work, and I'll show you why. And so that CFO never tried to get into the creative and say to me, well, the station's messed up, or the programming's wrong, or you have the wrong people. They showed me the numbers and said, if you do this and this, here's what would have to happen. You would have to increase the ratings by 25% in the first 3 months. Can you do that? And so it put me in a position of looking at things, analyzing, do I really think I can do that? Am I willing to gamble that that will work? And so, I mean, I don't know if that makes sense, Mary, but that's what worked for me was that CFO. And by the way, that CFO's, after that CFO left, the successor had the same attitude. And I felt confident to be able to sit down with that individual and say, here's my situation.
And I was kind of asking the backwards way. What could a CFO or senior finance person do to open the door? Because not every media company has a Mike McVay who's open to talking to people. There are going to be some people. And first, I have to tell you, I'm not a finance person, so I can speak from that side of the fence. Those finance people are creepy. They don't approve my expense reports. Why would I go to them? So what could a finance person do to start to develop that relationship?
If there is hopefully a regular leadership team meeting, however often it is, once a week, once a month, however often, if that financial person could look at the creative involved at the higher level in that company and say, hey, let me tell you things we've done before and share experiences they've had. If someone had sat down with me and said, when this and this happened, I was able to help them find the money to create a promotion that they thought they didn't have money for. Or I was able to help develop a creative way that we could hire this talent. And that's what we did. I talked about how at times I learned something I never knew before when it's October and we would be told, is there someone you're thinking you're going to have to terminate early next year? Let's figure out how we pay them off this year. And when that was happening, there was someone we felt we had to right size, and the head of finance said, you can go to that person. We owe them this many $1 million over 5 years. What if we gave them $1 million now and then pulled their salary down to $600,000 a year instead of $1 million a year? Yes, collectively it's less money by $1 million, but they're getting $1 million now. And that's something I would have never thought of. That financial person being proactive, understanding the challenge I had, helped me accomplish what I needed to accomplish for the good of the company.
Terrific. Has anybody else on this group worked with their finance team, and can they, or with their creative team, and can they talk about that and maybe ask Mike a question?
Mike, I wanted to ask you, what is the biggest challenge you're facing now in getting talent, in that the competition is greater with linear, digital, and streaming types of media? What is your biggest challenge in trying to secure talent?
So there's two sides of that. One is the accomplished talent. The other is a newer talent. The accomplished talent is a challenge because the streaming services, the DSPs, will overpay for a talent because they're trying to have a loss leader and bring people in. You point to Howard Stern, and it appears to have worked for SiriusXM, and what Mel Karmazin did all those years ago in paying him so much money and brought such an audience. A part of it, even if you've never listened to Howard Stern, is that it put SiriusXM on a map in a big way and showed how serious they were. And so that publicity was part of the marketing. What they might have spent on marketing, they put into talent. And so in our case, in traditional media like radio, you're up against the fact that the average person believes radio is over. You know, I'll sit in planes and people will say to me, what are you going to be doing in 10 years when radio's done? And it doesn't matter that I know 85% of all Americans still listen to radio every week. They don't listen as long as they did 10 years ago, but they still listen every week. That doesn't matter. The perception is radio is a dying entity. Over-the-air television is a dying entity. And so what we have to do with talent is sell them on the fact that there's a bigger footprint and that there's over-the-air radio, there's streaming, the same radio station is also on smart speakers, and it's on your phone. And those platforms give greater distribution than what a DSP has. Spotify wishes they had in America the number of radio listeners that we have. Amazon wishes they had the streaming that radio has. So you've just got to get out there and sell that talent on it. But as Amazon will step up and pay, pick a big name, 5 times what radio will. Here's the benefit radio has. Amazon's not hiring 200 or 2,000 talent. And so there's many more opportunities on traditional radio and in traditional media. Now, admittedly, if I was speaking at a personality conference, morning show boot camp, talkers, any of those things, somebody would say, well, we've destroyed radio, there's fewer jobs today, and so on. And that's true. But there's still more jobs in traditional media than there is in streaming, because streaming is a massive network. It just is. Look at SiriusXM. They have triple-digit channels, but they're not all banned. And so many of them repurpose content. And so what you have to do is just talk about the opportunity and what's there. That's it. It's sad that it's where it is, but there's been a couple periods in our life cycle in radio where, you know, we had consolidation explode in the early and mid 90s. And by the way, that was great for me. You're looking at somebody who benefited. That's when I owned radio stations and sold them. And McVay Media was sitting there, and if we were consulting a rock station in a cluster, and suddenly they bought 2 or 3 other stations, we could have specialists to consult them. Then we went through a period with further consolidation, and it was like the culling of the herd. There were a lot of air talent, jobs eliminated on sales and promotion and marketing. And then we settled into kind of where we are now. The big fear that talent have now is artificial intelligence. You know, Futori has created Radio GPT, which is, you know, it sounds pretty good, frankly. You have to listen a long time to grasp it. It's not quite there, but it sounds pretty good. Chat GPT, Enco, other companies are creating human sounding air talent. But I don't know how big it'll be. I mean, right now it's a little bit like cryptocurrency. Everybody's excited about it. It's a little bit like the .com era right now. Other questions?
As a follow-up, you spoke about footprint. The bigger the footprint, the better. For your consultancy specifically, where do you see the growth area? Are you advising any international companies or clients?
Yes. So I still consult radio stations. That's still a very important part of our business. But I consult syndicated and network programming. I coach talent. We're consulting an experiential marketing company that is global. They're based in London and Los Angeles. We consult a imaging and production company that's out of Stuttgart, Germany, and Los Angeles. We have a digital company out of Zurich, Switzerland, that's also global. So there's a lot more global things happening. You know, I'm speaking and working with a lot of project things. Large ad agencies will approach me and say, we're looking to develop a branded podcast for Edelman Financial Engines was one. The Rick Edelman Show for many years was on the radio and in 80 different markets. Edelman Financial Engines hired me to work with them on what was a short-term project that turned into a year of working with the radio show and rolling it into a large podcast presentation. So that started with Hill Holiday, the ad agency out of Boston, and then morphed into working directly for Edelman Financial Engines. I'm partners in a podcast production company, and so we have white labeled things for Nat Geo and Disney Plus. So, I used to say I'm coloring outside the lines when I do all those things, but those things now deliver more revenue than radio alone. And it's just how our business has grown. It's interesting to me, and if there are any radio finance people on here, my apologies. But what I've seen of late is radio handles nickels like manhole covers, and industries that are focused on audio will pay more for what we've learned from radio.
Makes sense. But that's wonderful that it's just, there's so many areas that you're growing into and you can provide your expertise. Does anybody else have a question?
Mike, Larry, thank you for your presentation. I'm curious as to, you say you do the coaching of on-air talent and things like that. If you can just tell us a war story about kind of a before and after success, that'd be great.
Sure. Stephen A. Smith, I think, hopefully most of you know Stephen A. Smith, who is a commentator on ESPN television. Stephen had been at ESPN early in his career, and I don't know if he was there 4 years, 5 years, but when his first deal came up, he was making good money, but he had seen how his star had grown, and he and his agent over-negotiated, and ESPN went, "It's the brand, it's not you, goodbye." And they just didn't renew him. Stephen sat out of work for a little while. Fox Sports Radio, which is syndicated by Premier Radio Network, hired him to do a radio program that was 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. East Coast, 3 to 6 a.m. West Coast. And so he was doing it live here out of New York, where I am now, every morning. Julie Talbot, who runs Premier Radio Network, who's a brilliant operator, reached out to me and said, "Hey, Mike, would you come coach Stephen for us? He's really talented. We're just having a difficult time getting him to understand radio and how the audio medium is different than the visual medium." And so, I came to New York regularly, would go in the studio with him at 6 a.m. We'd sit there and listen to him do his show. After the show, we would sit down and talk. If you buy Stephen's new book, I'm flattered. I mean, he had said, "Hey, I mentioned you in the book." I've been mentioning people's books, and normally when they do that, it means you get a line. He gave me a page and a half. Stephen, because he's a former athlete, and by the way, if any of you are athletes on this call, my experience is athletes have been coached all their lives, and so they take it to heart more quickly, and they work harder to perfect it. And Stephen did that. He worked very hard to understand why he needed to say certain things that would translate into ratings, why when it's an audio-only medium, you need to laugh aloud so people know you're joking. You need to say things differently. You need to vary the tone of your voice. You need to change your cadence to get people's attention, because people who listen to audio only multitask. And he just did great. He was fabulous. Now, Fox Sports Radio may not be thrilled that ESPN ended up hiring him back because of how much better he became and how well he was doing for them. But Larry, that would be one that comes to mind immediately, because he just grasped it. He got it. He really learned it quickly. To that athlete story, I like to tell a story that one time I was pulled into, because I live in Cleveland, I was pulled in to coach the then Cleveland Browns broadcast team. Neither of these two guys are there anymore, but it was a long-time Brown player who had moved into the color analyst position, Doug Deacon, and then a journeyman sportscaster who was a play-by-play guy. And when I sat down to do the coaching, the former athlete was writing down every word I said, and the longtime journalist had his arms crossed like this. And so that's one of those things. That was the moment that I went, you know what, athletes just take this advice quicker because they've had somebody with a bullhorn yelling at them since they were little kids. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Nobody's asked me anything hard yet, Cynthia.
Mike,
Well,
what if somebody were to ask you a hard question, what would that question be?
Oh boy, that's a good question. Let me think. Well, anecdotally, I would say it was that I trusted, when I was at Cumulus, I trusted my assistant to fill out my expense reports properly. That was probably, if somebody said to me, what's your biggest mistake you made around finance, that would be it. I didn't figure that out till I was leaving the company after 9 years.
You felt very shorted or overpaid?
It wasn't shorted. It was, she turned in things that had gone on my company credit card and I got paid for them and they were on the company credit card. And so I shouldn't have been reimbursed for them. And so I ended up having to strike a check as I was leaving.
wow.
That's not good. We
Yeah.
have a question in the chat. And the question is, what is your recommendation concerning repairing the good reputation of an entity after it has filed for bankruptcy and had to adjust its mission? How can media professionals help restore the reputation while not having the blowback of the bankruptcy stick to the media professional? Does the entity need to redesign or transform its media image? And you actually kind of went through that at Cumulus.
Yeah, I mean, Cumulus did go through a bankruptcy. And again, I mean, the CEO, I'm a fan. I know there's obviously people who are not fans of anybody, not fans of me or fans. I'm a fan. The approach was about retiring debt. It wasn't about eliminating people, or let me say lowering debt, not retiring, but lowering debt. And so, the approach itself was very strategic. Everyone was assigned, in my case, because I'm on the content side, was assigned to reach out to all of the agents who handled our talent and tell them what we were going through, and we we're going to honor the contracts and personalities, to go through supplier agreements, let them know we were honoring those agreements, and be very forthright, literally 24 hours before the bankruptcy became public, letting people know that. From the other side of it, as you might imagine, with it being high in the news today and in previous weeks about another major company about to go through bankruptcy, or let's set this wrong, let's say rumored to go through a bankruptcy, I have had friends of mine who work for that company, market managers, talent, programmers, call me. And all of them I've said my personal experiences, I can't speak for every company, but my personal experience was that not only did it not change negatively, it got better. I mean, after we went through that bankruptcy, suddenly I had money for marketing, I had money for promotion, I was able to do research. We did things that we were struggling to not have to do before. And so, I mean, if you're able to walk away with anything of what I've been telling my friends, it's that things got better. It impacts negatively the stockholders. It impacts negatively the people with the biggest chunks of equity. But as far as someone who was in rank and file, once you accept that your options are blown, everything got better. It just did. It got better.
Mike, can you comment on how your company or business is looking at the futuristic ways to generate revenue through either areas like AI with software companies or NFTs? What is your company right now huddling about looking at the futuristic ways to generate revenue?
Yeah, AI is probably the thing everyone's talking about the most, but a year ago it was the metaverse. And so that's why I say you have to pause and look at things. If I jump backwards for a second, I think there is something positive around the metaverse, meaning today's Beatles is Taylor Swift. And so if there's a metaverse where I can put on my goggles and watch a Taylor Swift concert, not on demand, but at a certain moment, streaming live to certain time zones, there's something there for not only the artist, but for media. And so the metaverse could put me virtually at that concert without having to pay $50 for a babysitter, without paying what an in-person ticket price is, still paying something. But that's one area that I think people can look at. When it comes to artificial intelligence, I can drive across America today and hear that there are no talent on a radio, 7 p.m. to midnight or overnight, and in some key day parts on a weekend. Excuse me. They could run syndication. They could put network programming on, but someone has made a decision that they don't want to give up the inventory to have that network, or they don't want to pay the $500 a month to have a voice track talent there. Artificial intelligence could be the voice 7 to midnight and overnight, and on cute day parts in a weekend. Artificial intelligence around a company like Futori or Enco is connected to what's in social media, what's on the internet, and could be connected to the National Weather Service to alert an audience that there's a tornado, could deliver information during a hurricane or forest fire or earthquake. Those natural disasters are a problem when there are radio stations that have nobody in the building or around at a lot of hours, nights and overnights and weekends. And so I think AI can be a benefit there. We're talking to broadcasters who are non-union. I don't want to get involved with WGA, the Writers Guild of America, but in writing commercial copy. They can be involved in helping produce commercial messages. They can be involved, AI can, around creating podcasts. And so those are two things: metaverse, putting it into the entertainment mode, AI, creating more connectivity with your market. The other thing we're talking about a lot is experiences. And part of why I decided I wanted to work with this experiential marketing company is, excuse me, in a world where the big radio groups are giving away $1,000 an hour in a group contest, it pales in comparison to the Powerball. It pales in comparison to $500 million this month in a lottery. If you can say to someone, we're going to send you to the royal coronation, or if you can say, it's rock, shop, and recover. We're going to fly you to Milano, Italy, where you'll see the Rolling Stones up close in person. Then you're going to shop in Monaco, and then to Maui to recover at the Grand Wailea. That rock, shop, and recover week-long event experience is something people in their mind look at and go, money can't buy this. In a world where people have on their bucket list that they want to go to Disneyland or Disney World or Euro Disney, those experiences create a greater affinity for a brand. And right now, it's so noisy out there. When I started in radio, and I've mentioned my gray hair, when it was black, we were playing top 40 music on an AM. Okay, think about that. People were giving FMs away because they couldn't generate any revenue on them. Then I lived through FM's explosion with album rock, top 40, 2FM. Now the majority, if not all music formats are on FM. And the competition today with streaming, with Spotify, Pandora, SiriusXM, Amazon, all of those things are loud. They create a lot of noise. So for radio today, there's more competition than ever, and there will continue to be. Those of you that are on the video side have to look at it, particularly if you're one of the network affiliates, and say, people that I'm paying money to are competing with me, with Peacock, with Paramount Plus, with ABC. And so all of those things are noisy. It shouldn't have been a surprise to anybody that Netflix is seeing subscription levels go down. And people who go, oh, Netflix is dead. It's not dead. There's more competition today. I can't even remember all the letters that are out there from ROKU and HULU that are now competing in streaming. And so all of that competition puts my company in a position where we're thinking about branding and how do you stand out and how do you make noise and what are those unique things we can do. And before someone says, Mike, what are those unique things? It's why content is so important today. And it's why personalities are so important. If you have an air talent, a personality who creates a bond with an audience, who marries your market, then people will come back to your brand over and over again. You heard me say, I've been married 45 years. There is no doubt in my mind, my wife can find a younger, better looking guy with more money than me. But she's trained me. She's broken my bad habits mostly. And so that's what talent have to do with the market, be it a national market or a local market, but they need to marry that market. So somebody has to be dramatically better to make me change and leave that marriage.
Thank you. Thank you for all that insight. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Yeah, I do. So
ahead.
using your last few minutes of exposition as sort of a guideline, if we look at how podcasting is looked at in the landscape of the different media available, how do you see that as is it more of a growing type of situation? Is it just another version of streaming, or is it a legitimate avenue alongside all the other established methodologies? And number one, and number two, since it's relatively a new form, do the radio people tend to have a benefit there in terms of how to do podcasting, or is it really driven by, let's say, the talent and the broadcasting ability kind of is learnable?
Let me start at the end of that question and work backwards. So people who are already skilled in audio do have a natural advantage when it comes to podcasting, but repeated radio shows don't do as well as unique content. So someone who just takes their 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. morning show and makes that a podcast, while that is your radio show on demand, it's not, there's not something new there. The talent who do best, who are radio talent, create their own unique podcast or have an hour after the show. Those of you who are familiar with Howard 100 on SiriusXM, which is a Howard Stern channel, they have an hour after Howard's show where they talk about parts of the show that didn't make it on the air, or things that were behind the scenes or an argument that happened. If talent can do that, if there's something unique, that's a benefit. That's an advantage. Personalities are very important, as you heard me say for radio, also with podcasting. Joe Rogan really does a radio show that's only available on a podcast. A guy named Tom Bernard in Minneapolis, a longtime broadcaster, now does a podcast that's heard every day that he does with his family, and he calls it The Family. It's Tom, his wife, his son, and his daughter. It's nowhere else but on that podcast. And so that creates a very specific reason and purpose to go there. It makes it a destination. Let me jump to the challenge with podcasting. Podcasting is for real, but 95% of it's hobbyists. 5% of it is for real. 5% of it is like an Edelman Financial Engines and their podcast, Everyday Wealth, that generates 44,000 downloads an episode. That's for real. That will get them leads and generate more business. Branded podcast, those things like Trader Joe's, which Sound That Brands has created, those are very specific podcasts that not only get an audience, but they sell products. Those are branded podcasts. Look at a podcast like Fly on a Wall. It has huge audiences and downloads because it's celebrities telling stories and just having fun. Those things are unique. The objective is to be one of the 5%. That's the objective. The reason you see an iHeart or Cadence 13, where Stephen A. Smith's podcast now is, the reason they go out and spend a lot of money is because those big talent make that podcast a destination. And so that's where you have to start. If you're sitting down and saying, we're going to create a podcast company, you got to have a big name. If you want to be dominant, you got to have a big reason. Now, you can grow your own, don't get me wrong. And a lot of podcast companies do that, but that's like being the Dave Matthews Band. Those of you who know the Dave Matthews Band, they spent 5 years of just performing at colleges for expenses only to become the Dave Matthews Band. And so the answer to your question is, podcasting is for real. You got to be in the top 5% to generate any real revenue. There's about a 35-cent cost per point, 35 cents per thousand value. Maybe someday that will flip, but I think it's a long way away. And let me tell you the difference between podcasting and, mass media. Podcasting is niche media. You still need mass media to drive niche media. If you listen to an iHeart radio station, the reason you hear so many podcasts, so many promos on the air for Ron Burgundy is because they're trying to drive people to the podcast. Mass media like radio and TV is a push. Digital and podcasting is a pull. I have to search it out. I have to find it. That's the difference. Does that answer your question?
A little, yeah, it does. And I guess then the follow-up question is are the economics different in terms of profitability? So, for example, traditional radio versus podcasting, are you making more dollars per whatever the measurement is, relatively speaking, because it's for lack of a better term, a hobbyist medium rather than a unionized commercial, established kind of practice like radio and TV?
It depends on the talent. When I left Cumulus Westwood One, the Ben Shapiro podcast was generating about 10 million a year. I don't know what it's doing today because we're in a post-pandemic world, everything's changed, but those great big names do generate great big revenue. But if you say just on a normal cost per point, it's 35 cents per 1,000 downloads. And so you've got to have a ton of downloads or be a branded podcast that somebody like a Progressive Insurance is very specifically underwriting, or a branded podcast like Edelman Financial Engines is very specifically underwriting because it brings them leads, and they're targeting people who have 1 to 3 million in investable income. And so that's very specific.
Okay. And I guess then just from your gray hair perspective, would podcasts in general sort of bring back the old radio drama aspect? Is there like another way of looking at podcasts? Because you see a lot of these true crime and other story-based podcasts, which are all basically audio stories.
Yeah, and that has happened. First off, there is a company out of Chicago where Mary is that owns the rights to all those old radio shows, and they do present them like a podcast. But all of the true crimes things, true crime is a huge, podcast dating back to NPR with Serial. I mean, Serial really brought that whole thing to light, and it exploded. I used to say to people initially when Serial was exploding, I would say, that's a unicorn. That's finding a unicorn in the woods. And then when it really exploded, I said, that's like finding an albino Siamese unicorn. Because it was just so rare. But it did drive true crime, and that's very real. One of my guilty pleasures is Dateline NBC on Friday night. I watch it on demand, but that's one of my guilty pleasures. And if I am traveling, I will flip and listen to the audio version only. So the answer is yes, that's driven it. And that's bringing people back to audio. And by the way, younger people are platform agnostic. Whatever has their favorite content is where they go.
Oh, your Dateline secret is safe with us.
Thanks.
We have, I think, time for one more question, and then we should wrap up. Is there one last question? Scared them away.
My email address is Mike McVay, MikeMcVay @McVaymedia.com. If anybody wants to email me further, certainly feel free to do so.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful and really interesting. I learned a lot of stuff I didn't know today, but I think that other people did too. So that was fabulous.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. The recording, Cynthia, will be available in a couple of days. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I want to thank you as well, Mike. It was wonderful. We really appreciated you sharing your insights, your experiences, and knowledge. It's going to make us all wiser. Thank you so much for coming and sharing this time with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Cynthia.